Hey everyone, I wanted to do a demo on how to use a two-tone underpainting, not dissimilar to what we used in acrylics, to really define your light, which is really helpful in your concept renderings. So first thing I'm doing is I know those little whiskers are going to be heck to go around later, so I used a white colored pencil to kind of go over them so that they'll sort of repel the marker, which will give me some nice highlights on them later. First thing I'm doing is deepening my background behind the mouse. He's on a little log. I want there to be like the background is receding behind him, so I'm using a cool gray. What I'm going to use for my shadows is all cool, really blue-gray and blue tones, and then for my light in this one I'm going to use kind of a bright yellow and a tanny yellow. So a couple different layers of grays to really make the background contrast with him to start with. Now I've got a very pale blue that I'm using to just start blocking in all of the shadow areas. I'm covering not quite 50% of the piece when I'm doing these shadows, but I am, really applying them pretty heavily, especially since I'm keeping them pretty light, but knowing that if there's somewhere I want to be bright white, maybe not to cover that yet. But there isn't in this one, but if you haven't. When I'm applying these shadows to the log, I'm using sort of a random squiggly pattern to help build up many layers of that. Will give a lot of depth when we finally get a look at the moss that's on this log. So now I'm applying the yellows. First pass is in a very tan yellow. The second pass is in a much more saturated, more of a lemon yellow. I'm applying these anywhere that I want this warm light to be focused on. I am applying it and preserving it more heavily on the mouse. I'm going to go over it with lots of layers in the log so that yellow sort of settles in more, but we're going to let peek through layers on the mouse to help draw attention and focus there. Deepening a couple shadows with the blue. It's all about finding balance between your shadows and your highlights. It's hard to think of highlights as being that dark yellow, but I promise it'll be fine. So now we're applying local color, which means the real color of the mouse, the tans, the grays, the whites that make up this actual mouse texture. But because they're layering over these other colors that we've already put on, you're going to already have a sense of light built in. So even though that was just applied flat with a gray and a light tan, it's already, you're already seeing the shadow and the light peeking through it. So this is a pale gray that I'm using, a warm gray that's kind of tannish to help build up some of my midtones. Use the little bullet and some precise details to keep me spaced in while I'm thinking. Put the whiskers back in so that as I start applying these local colors and larger, flatter washes, I'm not losing these details from my drawing. So this is kind of a warm, muted tan, couple layers of different colors of that I'm using to create his local color. You can see it's slowly starting to blend and mask in the underpainting from underneath, but it's still definitely peeking through. This is kind of a caramel color going over the top. Where it hits the yellow, it looks really bright. Where it hits the blue, it really tones it down. Put the pink in for the nose. I'm letting some areas show through brighter, so right on this one shoulder it's staying very yellow because I know that that's a big highlight area, and the color there is lighter on my mouse. He's got kind of white shoulder, almost white, cream, I don't know. White colored pencil to redo some of the whiskers, to bring some of the whites and light hair texture back in around the chin. Sorry, the light from my window really blew this one out, but I promise you'll see how all the tones showed out at the end. So we're adding texture into the highlight on the log, and now we're going to start squiggling in this green. I'm like keeping a light hand and kind of squiggly at the top and really heavy at the bottom because I know I'm going to go over that a bunch of times to build the shadow, right? Swatching it over on the side. I've got all the colors I'm using over there on the same swatch card so you can kind of see them when this is done, but that's how I can see how the green's going to move over something. So several different layers of different greens, sort of a squiggle pattern. I've realized I'm going to use this gray down here on the log to bump some of the shadows, so I'm bringing it up and touching up the contrast, bumping the contrast on the mouse so that he is always the most contrasty thing. Moving on to the background while the log sort of sits for a minute. Using this purple mauve color to really warm up this back tone because I know I'm going to use a brown that's close to the color actually of the mouse. So by layering that purple underneath, it keeps it both cooler and a different tone than him. So now I'm taking some grays and purples and going back over that and really adding richness right behind him to bump him forward. So he needs to have contrast with his background or he won't seem to be sitting closer to us, right? Another layer of the taupe. Now going in and touching up, darkening up details, those little specific tiny contrast areas that make things feel really crisp. And then bumping the contrast on the bottom of the log. Always bumping that up so that it seems to go recede from us and also so that it draws the attention to the top of the log, which is where the mouse is, right? A little bit of gel pen to add some of the hair texture back in and to add a couple highlights on whiskers. And that is our little guy. There you go. A little clearer picture of him because the light was really blowing it out. But you can see how our underpainting really shows through, defines our light, directs our attention, and gives our focal point and mood back to the character.